Once again, and more officially, as usual, welcome everyone to today's meeting of our Milan seminar in the history of modern moral philosophy. It's very nice to see all of you attending and coming back to our event series. Today's guest, as announced, is Aaron Garrett. Aaron is professor of philosophy at Boston University, and as you basically already know, he has published widely on many topics and authors in modern philosophy, and especially on moral philosophy, ranging from Spinoza to Adam Smith and beyond. Aaron has published a monograph on Spinoza, has edited 2 volumes on Scottish philosophy, along with James Harris, is editing a forthcoming collection on naturalism, modern philosophy with Routledge, and most importantly, is now working on a new, larger, and very ambitious, as far as I can tell, book project, which is also the topic of his talk today. We gave in our announcement a more modest title, Modern Moral Philosophy, a book project. Probably we should have given the official book title, as far as I can read in his manuscript, which is The Devil's Mountain, which is far more appealing and far more enticing in a way. So, Aaron, we are really happy to have you here today, and we are looking forward to your presentation to discussion. So, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to give this presentation, and I know quite a few of you, so it's a great pleasure to speak with you. This project has been underway for a long time. In fact, at the beginning of the book, in the acknowledgement section, it says, there's a quote from Cavendish, which is, "When I did write this book, I took great pains, for I did walk and think and break my brains." And I've been breaking my brains over this for quite a few years. And the proximate cause of it was a conversation I had with my then colleague, Simon Keller, that we were walking to the gym. And I offhandedly asked him why so many moral philosophers assume that an exclusive and unified account of moral justification is high on the list of a desiderata of a moral theory. And not all, obviously, not Ross, but many, and even most. And in his usual way, Simon said, "I'm really not sure about that." And I started thinking about this, and I started thinking about this as a historian. And then in, I think, 2016 or 2015, Roger Crisp invited me to write an article on early modern moral philosophy for the Oxford Handbook of, I think, the History of Moral Philosophy. And the basic ideas that are in the chapter that I sent around came into form of thinking about how to characterize the kind of approach to ethics that that is in place when modern moral philosophy begins to take shape, and prior to it, and as I argue in the chapter, posterior to it as well, that the sort of perennial approach to ethics. And my late friend Amelie Rorty, after reading the article I wrote for Roger Crisp, suggested I write a book, a short book based on this. And the short book has turned into a long book over a long time, and hopefully it's turning back more into a short book. Those of you who've known me for years have probably noticed that my beard has grown, and about 3 or 4 years ago, I took an oath not to shave my beard until the book was finished. And hopefully I won't have to sit on my beard. Hopefully it won't get so long that I'm able to sit on my beard. But it's very much still a project underway as opposed to a book, although all chapters have been written, at least in part. And the structure is in place, but the devil of the Devil's Mountain is in the details with this book. So, as I just suggested, what it's an attempt to do is to explain how modern moral philosophy, and I'll characterize it in just a moment, came to be the dominant species of ethics, at least in academic context, at least among academic philosophers. Um, in order to do this, in the book, I try to mount an argument about where it came from, and um, also try to argue for a particular account of what it is. And I wanted to just start saying something about what I understand modern moral philosophy to be. Um, so the expression modern moral philosophy is highly ambiguous, as I'm sure you all know. Like terms like enlightenment, clear whether it refers to a historical period or a movement or a type of philosophy or some combination. Um, I take it to refer to a type of philosophy which arises in a particular historical period, and which doesn't really exist prior to this particular historical period. And if one assumes, as I do, that it's a type of philosophy, then it's not clear whether it's a species of ethics or whether it's, as someone like Sidgwick thinks, the truth of the ethical method becoming manifest through modern moral philosophy, from common sense nonsense to systematic ethics. And there are a lot of different ways of defining it. So one can define it by stressing distinctive features or properties it has. So, for example, Grotius is sometimes argued to be a modern moral philosopher, the first modern moral philosopher, the pioneering modern moral philosopher. For those of you who've read Terry Irwin's um, Development of Ethics, there's a wonderful chapter under the topic Grotius, No Pioneer, where he disputes this idea, but there's a very common view on which Grotius is the pioneer insofar as he pioneered subjective ethics, subjective rights. And by presenting a concept of subjective rights, rights that inhere in subjects and are powers, moral powers that allow them to act rightly, he started a train of argument that ends up in full-blooded modern moral philosophy. So that would be specifying a particular property that you think is important. Or you can focus, as most people do, I think, who talk about it, on the distinction between modern moral philosophy and ancient moral philosophy, or modern moral philosophy and scholastic philosophy. For example, Ross distinguishes very famously between, and Sidgwick does as well, I think Ross really takes this from Sidgwick, between the good, insofar as ancient philosophers are interested in explaining what the good is and what's the best good, to the right. Modern moral philosophers are interested in explaining what's right action, what makes action right, and how do we determine particular right actions. So these are all sort of different ways of thinking about it. One last way of thinking about it is that you might distinguish between modern moral theories as being impartialist, and this is sort of broad, argues for this, modern moral theories as being impartialist, and this in distinction from ancient and some early modern theories, which are egoist theories. So the rise of impartialist ethics is what makes something a modern moral theory. So perhaps the two most influential characterizations of modern moral philosophy are due to Sidgwick and Anscombe. And Anscombe is the person who popularized the term, and probably maybe even coined the term. I'm not exactly sure. But certainly when you say the expression modern moral philosophy, you often mean either the famous essay by Anscombe, or you mean to discuss Sidgwick's well-known account of it. So in Methods of Ethics, Sidgwick identified modern moral philosophy with what he called quasi-jural theories, by which he meant moral theories that have, on analogy with positive laws, moral laws or rules which guide and direct right action. And he argued that although you can see some of this in Stoic ethics, and you can see some of this in scholastic philosophy. It's with 17th century ethicists, Hobbes, Cumberland, a few others, that you start to see people conceiving of ethics as a system of rules or systems of laws whose ultimate purpose is action guiding and through action guiding and in particular guiding action in such a way as it gives rise to right actions. So I think there's a lot to be said for this view. And Anscombe actually, despite the fact that Modern Moral Philosophy, her essay, is a pillaring of Sidgwick among many other people she attacks, I think she agrees with this as well, that modern moral philosophy is a form of jural ethics that's focused on right action. But of course, unlike Sidgwick, Anscombe thought that a further distinctiveness of modern moral philosophy was that the rules and laws which guide right action in modern moral philosophy were not justified by a superior legislator as they had been in scholastic philosophy. And as a consequence, she thought that, she thought this was contradictory insofar as she thought that what modern moral philosophers proposed was there was obliging laws and obligation without a legislator making the moral laws binding on us. As a consequence of this, she thought that rightness, insofar as it's supposed to be instantiated in actions, was fictive. And the whole edifice that was built on this notion of quasi-jural ethics without a legislator was nonsense and destructive nonsense in her view. So for Anscombe, the answer to a question that Sidgwick thought of as being central to modern moral philosophy, what is duty and what is its ground, is nothing. And the same goes for right action. And there's a huge amount of controversy. I know, well, controversy is too strong. There's a huge amount of disagreement about exactly what Anscombe is saying, because as you all know, it's a very, very briskly written essay. But I think that is pretty much clearly one of the things she's arguing. So my view and my understanding of modern moral philosophy is primarily influenced by Sidgwick. But there's a central proviso that I sort of take from Anscombe. So like Sidgwick, I hold that modern moral philosophy is a species of ethics. So I hold there's a larger category of ethics, and in it there's a distinctive species of ethics. And like Sidgwick, I hold that it normally takes a jural form, although unlike Sidgwick and Anscombe, I don't think the form is necessary or its most distinctive feature. So I don't think, although I could be easily swayed, but I don't think that what makes modern moral philosophy is this jural form wholly. And I agree with both of them that modern moral philosophy normally involves rightness, and that the focus is on giving rise to right actions, not the highest good and not virtue and not many of the other things that are so common to ethics in the ancient world and in the schools and in scholastic views. There's a focus on particular right action. But again, I'm not sure that this is definitive either, although I think it's perhaps a necessary condition of modern moral philosophy. And like Anscombe, I think that the lack of a legislator is crucial to modern moral philosophy. I think, or let me put this more weakly, because I think that the idea that modern moral philosophy might be binding without a divine legislator is very important to modern moral philosophy. A binding legislator who directly legislates these laws, and for this reason, and the sanctions attached to them, they're binding. But I don't think this is worrying, because I think Anscombe is wrong that a law or rule can't be obligatory without a superior obliging it. And that's because what I think is that values are the source of impersonal obligation in modern moral philosophy. And what's distinctive about modern moral philosophy is that it is a highly systematic and unified system which prioritizes those values which justify and dictate right actions. So I think of it as being like a value like utility, or a value like happiness. What makes it modern moral philosophy is that the value ultimately justifies and dictates what counts as a right action, and it does it through a highly systematic, unified method. So, so I just said this, but for example, utilitarianism takes the form of action guiding laws and rules, and utilitarianism focuses on right actions, in this case, those actions which maximize the good, but it does so through identifying a value, utility, or happiness, which justifies and specifies actions and makes them obligatory. A legislator may be necessary to codified utility in a system of laws, as Bentham suggests, but a legislator is not necessary to make it the case that when one recognizes the greatest happiness principle, one ought to maximize utility. And the same might be said of deontic theories. I say very little about Kant because I fear saying anything about Kant because I'm wholly aware of my poverty of my knowledge of Kant. But I do very much think this is the case of Richard Price. And I think Richard Price is absolutely central to this story. And in some senses, I think Richard Price is the first full-blooded modern moral philosopher, and Richard Price's conception of rightness, as argued for in the 1760s, sorry. For Price, the value of rightness itself is systematically justified and systematically employed to direct and necessitate general and particular actions. So I, drawing on Sidgwick and drawing on Anscombe, but with a modification, define modern moral philosophy as a now dominant type of normative moral theory, and I identify it with normative theory because I think although there are meta-ethical commitments and practical commitments that arise from modern moral philosophy, ultimately it's an approach to normative ethics, which prioritizes unity, systematicity, and impartiality. And this usually takes the form of action guiding rules and laws, but not necessarily. And the rules and laws are justified and explained by a specific moral value. Happiness or intrinsic rightness are two familiar such values, or a set of compatible moral values or reasons, which then provide the basis for obligation. On my view, the focus in these theories is on the systematic determination of actions through and insofar as they give rise to and instantiate moral values. So one point of the first chapter, so that's the background idea about what the species of modern moral philosophy is, and the book is attempting to give an argument both for this as being a way of characterizing modern moral philosophy and giving it a genealogy of where it came about. So one point of the first chapter is to undermine the assumption that this is the sort of form that ethics necessarily must take, that modern moral philosophy is the only plausible form of ethics. And here again, I'm agreeing with Anscombe. It's the only plausible form of ethics, and it's the only satisfying or avoiding the word good, workable account of ethics. So in the chapter, I suggest that it's not all obvious that ethics should take this form. In fact, there's an alternative which is and was perfectly satisfactory in its own way. And it's fact, I think, an alternative that most people who aren't academic philosophers assume is ethics. I think there's a footnote to the chapter where I mention a story that my colleague Paul Katsafonis told me about how he was at a graduate student mixer at Harvard, and a student in English came up to him and said, "Oh, you're a philosopher?" And he said, "Yes." And the student asked him what his sayings were. And he, of course, laughed at this. But I think it very well illustrates that what we take to be an ethical theory is not at all what most people understand ethics to be. And obviously, many people have argued that something like what I describe in this chapter is satisfactory, or in many cases, like Anscombe or virtue ethicists or Pierre Hadot, a better approach to ethics. I'm not arguing it's a better approach, it's a different. What's distinctive, I think, in my argument is I define what I call moral self-help as a moral species of a far more ubiquitous and general approach to life in the world, which I argue is found in everything from yoga classes to a wide range of therapies to Marie Kondo's manuals for simplifying your life. And I define the genus as authoritative counsels meant to help initiates or students or disciples to acquire desirable goods or states for themselves and to change them into, and these states change them into more authoritative selves who have the means to master themselves and to help themselves and others access more desirable goods and states. So philosophical self-help, on my view, is the species where the counsels and means to change into an authoritative self are philosophical, where philosophical is understood as a perennial philosophical wisdom associated with Socrates and Aristotle and Cicero and whoever else it might be. And I also stress in this chapter that self-knowledge is, in many of these theories, a crucial means to self-mastery and a crucial means to become a more authoritative and elite self. And I think that this is due to the fact that it's played such a central role in these philosophical theories, due to that from Socrates onward, it's been highlighted as the mechanism for self-help, that the unexamined life is not worth living, and its analogs of this sort of claim, and the analogs of this sort of claim in the various schools. So my final definition of self-help is authoritative philosophical counsels and practices, which when known, understood, and applied to oneself, give rise to self-knowledge and wisdom, and through them, the art to master oneself and to access more desirable goods and states, and ultimately the most desirable goods and states, i.e. felicity. I use this language of desirable goods and states because I don't want to assume either that in these theories there's one good or state. I think like there's a tendency when talking about 17th century ethics and ancient moral philosophers, people who do classics don't do this, but people who do 17th and 16th century ethics do this, to assume that the general framework for all these kinds of theories is Aristotelian in some form, and there's some kind of unified conception of happiness. And I don't think that's the case. I think one interesting feature both of the ancient schools and of 17th century philosophy is their diverse goods and states, which the theories move you towards, both diversity among the different kinds of theories, whether you're an Epicurean or a Stoic or a modern, some eclectic modern, eclectic early modern ethicist, or internal to particular approaches, there's also multiple goods and states counseled. A good example would be someone like Montaigne, who it's very, very difficult to reduce Montaigne to one desirable good or state. And I think that's consistent with many, many of these modern early modern ethical theories. So far, so good. I mean, am I making sense so far? Some? Okay. So I won't talk about the details of the chapter, but given that this approach is still widespread, I begin the chapter by talking about the experience many of us have had of going to a university bookstore or just a bookstore in general and going to the philosophy section and discovering the philosophy section has very little that we understand to be philosophy in the philosophy section. So it's certainly still a ubiquitous approach to ethics and to philosophy more generally. Why has it been supplanted among professional philosophers by this approach modern moral philosophy, which actually seems extremely peculiar from the perspective of these kinds of ethical theories and extremely restricted. So my answer is that the rise of modern moral philosophy is the consequence of a century-long trajectory in ethics initiated by Hobbes. And this isn't exactly a novel claim, saying that Hobbes is central to the rise of modern moral philosophy. This is Sidgwick's view and the view of many others. I think the novelty of my view is, unlike Sidgwick, I think it's not for the most part Hobbes's particular challenges to morality. I mean, with one important exception that I'll describe in a moment. But it's not in particular his challenges to morality. It's his formal and epistemic approach to morality that becomes so important, giving rise to these challenges of morality. And in particular, I think what's crucial in Hobbes is Hobbes rejected building moral philosophy on a let me put it in the positive way. Hobbes built his moral philosophy on an embrace of the new science and an embrace of the formal and epistemic aspects of the new science, which he thought should be applied to moral philosophy as well. So Hobbes thought that moral philosophy ought to be systematic in the way that geometry is systematic, and when he thought that it should be systematic in the way geometry is systematic, he thought it should be systematic in the way that Galilean geometry is systematic, and it ought to satisfy the epistemic bars that the new science did, as opposed to what he thought were the highly questionable Aristotelian epistemic assumptions that he thought undermined the success of moral philosophy. So I think Hobbes is the central figure because for him, or he's the first really to argue that moral philosophy ought to take the form of a highly systematic demonstrative theory, which has its primary focus as guiding actions. And the title of this work, The Devil's Mountain, refers to a passage in Hobbes's Behemoth where Hobbes says that if you were to understand if you wanted to understand the range of human nature, like the range of the kinds of good and bad things that humans do, you would need to stand, and this is his phrase, as if it were on a devil's mountain. So he's imagining standing in the highest viewpoint in hell and look down on what happened in England between 1640 and 1660. So he's making this claim that between 1640 and 1660, you had a civil war in England that was so extreme that you begin to understand you can begin to understand the range of human nature, and from this you can build an adequate theory of human nature. So the reason for this title is, I think what Hobbes does with the state of nature argument in the three different presentations of his civil philosophy is argues for an epistemic standpoint from which you are able to understand human nature and human action, and from which you then ought to rebuild ethics. And I think Hobbes identifies this standpoint with the kind of standpoint that Galileo and others take in the new science. So I think what Hobbes is doing is he's importing, highly syncretically and very strangely, he's importing a idea of impartial epistemic authority from the new science into moral philosophy. And it's this syncretic approach, I think, that starts moral philosophy on its path, or starts ethics on its path towards modern moral philosophy. And one of the side consequences of this is through arguing that from the standpoint of the state of nature, which, by the way, he frames very much like a Galilean thought experiment. So it's very, very similar to how Galileo understands thought experiments to work within a physical theory. Hobbes argues that there is no such thing as natural morality, and the moral duties associated with Cicero, Aristotle, and the many others who were influenced by them aren't natural moral duties at all. And that's where, so I said a moment ago that it's not the content so much as the formal epistemic features of the theory. And on my view, the way in which Hobbes, the radical way in which Hobbes thinks about a moral theory, gives rise, as a quasi-scientific theory, gives rise to this shocking result that there is no such thing as natural morality in the normal sense of natural morality. And on my view, maybe back up a little bit. Hobbes, I don't think, had really cared that much about what I've described as self-help theories. I think that wasn't really Hobbes's target. But by undermining natural morality, and in particular, by undermining the idea that morality was structured around a set of core natural duties, which had at their center a adult man, male property holder, he undermined the Ciceronian picture of ethics. And by undermining the Ciceronian picture of ethics, he undermined one of the important ways in which self-help theories thought about how ethics worked. So, as I said in the beginning, I think it's kind of like the self-help, the upending of self-help, I think is kind of a side consequence of Hobbes's approach. But what Hobbes's approach ultimately did was, in the words of my colleague Suzanne Schriedhart, dethroned the authority, that dethroned the idea that morality had to cluster around a particular kind of agent who had particular kinds of natural duties, which only they could satisfy, and which were then the center of ethical theories more generally, by undermining the presumptive natural authority of the husband, father, master as the fulcrum of morality. So you might think to yourself, other than you said you were going to talk 20 minutes and it's now 40 minutes, I'm sorry, but you might think to yourself, well, okay, so Hobbes gives rise to moral philosophy, but that's actually not my view either. My view is Hobbes in many ways is not really a normative ethicist as we understand normative ethics. Hobbes clearly has at least one strong normative claim: you ought to move into the state. But he doesn't present his theory as a normative ethical theory in the way that we understand normative ethical theories. It's rather, my view is rather that the immediate reaction to Hobbes, which you might call early modern Protestant natural law, is to try to find a conservative way to save natural morality, and in particular to save these fundamental duties. And you see this in Pufendorf, you see this in Cumberland, you see this in all the immediate respondents, immediate powerful responses to Hobbes. And what's interesting about these theories is they don't just, some people just restate like a Ciceronian or a Aristotelian account against Hobbes, but the sophisticated theorists, how they operate is they argue against Hobbes on what they take to be common ground with Hobbes. So someone like Cumberland, who I think is very important in this story, argues that if you really have a sophisticated natural account of what natural science is, and you really understand what natural laws are and laws are, you can argue against Hobbes that in fact that benevolence is a property of systems and understood in the best new science manner, and benevolence gives rise to these natural duties, and it's a natural moral property. So the idea is that it's these conservative thinkers, and I mean just conservative in the sense of conserving these natural law duties, who are crucial insofar as they try to find ingenious ways to accept Hobbes's epistemological and methodological challenge, but at the same time to use it to bring back the fundamental familial duties that Hobbes had eviscerated. And when you think about it, when you realize this, you see that Locke clearly does this in his discussion of husband and wife in the second treatise on government, on the paternal and parental relations. Pufendorf does this throughout his work. And then other figures like Leibniz and Spinoza have different kinds of responses to Hobbes. They're not so conservative, but they also take over Leibniz, and both of them explicitly. Leibniz is, as you know, a great fan of Hobbesian moral theory, and particularly the systematic approach. They take over Hobbes's idea of a systematic new science-based moral philosophy, but then they use it to go in directions that Hobbes would never allow for. Leibniz, his account of justice, which he thinks arises once you realize Hobbes made certain mistakes, and Spinoza undermining the artificial natural distinction in Hobbes, which he argues is arbitrary, and using that to bring back a conception of virtue, albeit a conception of virtue that's very different from the kind that Cicero argued for. So all of these philosophers took Hobbesian doctrines and ideas on board, but they often attempted to use their agreements with Hobbes against him to rescue natural morality or natural duties, or the kind of paternalist assumptions at the heart of Ciceronian moral theory. As part of this discussion, I also go through one very particular natural law duty. I discuss the relation between masters and slaves, or masters and servants, and I try to show how Grotius offers an account of the relation between masters and slaves that I think Hobbes attacks, and then how Pufendorf tries to bring it back in a different form. But very quickly, what Pufendorf does is he gets rid of Grotius's idea that slavery is justified as a moral punishment. And he tries to, because Hobbes, of course, would not allow that there's a natural moral punishment in this case. And he argues instead that slavery should be understood primarily as contractual on Hobbesian terms. But he brings back the duty and the obligation on a reconstructed Hobbesian way. And then I argue that you can see then in Carmichael and Hutcheson the consequences of this for ultimately undermining the duty, okay, of a slave to their master and the obligations of masters to slaves. So we have this intermediate generation of philosophers, and I don't really think I think Cumberland gets kind of close, but I don't think they really are modern moral philosophers in the sense that I've described either. For me, the decisive figures are Mandeville and Hutcheson. And Mandeville, insofar as he brings back with comic gusto the attack on natural morality, which we saw in Hobbes, in a reinvigorated form. And then Hutcheson, insofar as I try to argue that he, like the prior generation of philosophers, tries to respond to Mandeville, this reinvigorated Hobbesian, by putting moral philosophy on a new science-inspired moral epistemology, his moral sense, and his general account of moral perception, and as you know, his Newtonian calculus of utility and all these other systematic features of Hutcheson. And in doing this, he gives rise to a, I think, brilliant synthesis of many, many different strands of the prior generations, Cumberlandian utilitarianism or proto-utilitarianism and virtue theory, and the stress on the rightness of an action ultimately being in the intention or motivation of the action, all these different combined features that you find in Hutcheson. The inquiry contains multitudes, and it's one of the difficulties of talking about Hutcheson that you're almost always, as soon as you start talking about Hutcheson, you make him a proto this or a proto that. But when you make him a proto this or proto that, he just as often could be said to be the proto opposite to what you're making him a proto, whether it's utilitarian or deontic or whatever it is. So the synthesis, I think, is very brilliant, but it's also extremely tenuous. And then the final part of the book is an argument that when modern moral philosophy really comes into existence, with the rise of deontic and utilitarian and impartialist theories, and the three figures I think are the most important for this are Adam Smith in the impartialist case, John Gay, who I think is the most important of the early utilitarians, and Richard Price, who I think is one of the most undervalued of all philosophers, great moral philosophers, and who gives us, I think, a very coherent deontic theory. Strikingly, all of them explicitly engage with Hutcheson and view their theories as a response to Hutcheson. So each one of them views their theory as responding to Hutcheson, criticizing Hutcheson, but showing how Hutcheson's argument leads you to having a much more coherent, systematic, action-guiding account of ethics. And the case of Adam Smith is a little more complicated, but in the case of Gay and Price, I mean, obviously he's Hutcheson's student, but it's a little more complicated in relation to moral philosophy, modern moral philosophy. But in the case of Gay and Price, they view what they view as the incoherencies in Hutcheson's moral sense as being resolved by showing that there's a single value, utility or happiness and rightness, respectively, which you can build an action-guiding normative moral theory about, and which is sufficient for obligation. And my suggestion in the book then, and what I'm arguing for the book, is that there's a long gradual process which begins with Hobbes, and Hobbes is concerned for finding a removed scientific viewpoint in his philosophical works from which you can ascertain what human nature is like, which has the consequence of an attack on natural morality through Hobbes's critics, and his critics begin to give rise to some of the features of how I understand modern moral philosophy through Hutcheson, who I think provides the most powerful synthesis of all of these strands, and very novel synthesis of all these strands, to ultimately the rise of modern moral philosophy in Richard Price, John Gay, and dare I say it, Kant, although I just don't know enough. I don't know enough about Kant to speak about Kant publicly, but in things that we recognize as modern moral philosophy. So anyway, that's the structure of the work. I hope that was moderately coherent. And that's that.